We'll crack on, I think. Thank you very much indeed. Hope you've all got your step meters, because we actually do quite a lot of walking today between different parts of the building. We are staying put for the minute because we are lucky to have Ewan McIntosh with us for the next keynote. He's the founder of NoTosh, a creative learning company working with schools and other organizations with learning at their heart. And this should be fun, but also there'll be a clear message at the end of it that you can take forward. Please make him welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for the welcome. Thank you for coming along. We're talking for the next 40 minutes or so about the idea of creativity, but not just any old creativity, collective creativity, and why is it so important for students in our schools, but also as teaching teams to work together to be more creative, more ingenious in what we create. Now, the whole reason that our team does the work it does all across the world is established in our purpose statement, our vision, if you like, of what we hope to envision one day. And the key thing that we believe is that individuals might be doing the work, but if you want to do work that really matters, it needs to be done by a collective, by teams. And that big ideas and big challenges in this world can't be solved by lone geniuses. They need people to come together. The way that we do it is through the various lenses of design thinking. And put simply, it means that we take out time to design the way we want to think for the thing that we're trying to achieve. Too often it's the point that's zapped in favor of running through content. We've got this to do, we've got that to do, but actually stopping to think about how you want to approach a challenge makes the difference between a mediocre outcome and an ingenious outcome. And creativity is really about that ingenious moment at the where new ideas come. And very simply, we work with kids in learning to help them understand, first of all, what is. So when you look at the current issue of, say, climate change, what exactly are the facts? What do we think we know about the issue? And then we ask, what if? We find interesting challenges that maybe people haven't spotted yet and ask, what if we did things differently? The most important question maybe, what wows, what excites us about what we've spotted? And young people can get superbly excited about things that are in the curriculum when they discover it for themselves. Somehow when you tell them what's meant to wow them, it wows them a little bit less. And then what works? And that's where, once more, the role of teachers is so important, helping young people really fathom what's feasible today, what can we prototype and test out today and get a result for. So very simply put, that's the process. But if you think that it's possible for a lone genius to somehow do this, I would say you're mistaken. The standard definition of creativity is that it's some kind of process leading to novelty, and the killer line, that it's tied to the individual. And we don't believe that's true. That too often in school we focus on individual outcome. If you think of most testing that you do, it's about individual outcomes. How many processes do you have to assess team ability to produce something? Do you have assessments for teaming? Do any of your national assessments explore how young people work in a team? No. And what's the only thing that matters for anyone on this planet is how you work together with others to solve the problems that really matter. So instead, our company chief operating officer also happens to be an incredibly talented educator, Dr. Cannon Robinson. And in his PhD, this line really struck me. He said, creativity is something that arises from the collective. It's social, not individual. And when you start realizing that creativity is a social beast, it changes everything you think about it. Now, as was alluded to in the introduction, 30% of our work is actually not in schools. It's working with the kind of people in suits that you see going to the other conference downstairs. Can you imagine trying to get them to be collectively creative about anything? But it is possible. Do they watch the web stream? That's the question. We'll find out in about 5 minutes' time as they come in through the door. When we look at this research, this is actually research from the corporate world, not from schools. And we changed some of the wording, so instead of input from customers and staff, it says input from staff, students, teachers, and parents. So if you're coming up with a new idea, a new unit of work, imagine that the responsibility is not purely yours. Imagine the responsibility for coming up with that unit of work is shared with your students. What would it feel like to negotiate a project with your students rather than feeling the pressure is on you in your study or your kitchen or your bedroom, wherever you do your planning, studying? The metaphor I use is that when you work collaboratively with students to plan a unit, it's always going to be more relevant. Because as a secondary school teacher, I had 180 different souls coming in through the door every week. There was no way that I could personalize learning for each and every one of them through some form of teacher-led, teacher-centered way of planning. I had to co-design with them as we went. And by doing that, it was the equivalent of having 180 kids right behind you as you plan a unit of work, but without having to have them in your kitchen while you do your planning. And in business, it's the same, where organizations undertake their strategy work in a unilateral way. This means that there's very little visible process to how they come up with decisions, and people generally don't feel consulted. So they just say, you know, it's what I call thou shalt strategy. The boss comes out and tells you this is the way it's going to be. And 36% of organizations, corporates, actually work that way. And that's why when you, quite a lot of the schools we work with will have boards, school boards, made up of people who work in the world of business, and they cannot understand why you would go about strategy in a collaborative way because they're used to sitting, as one pharmaceutical executive told me, sitting in a hotel bedroom the night before deciding what the strategy will be. It's very unsuccessful, though. Companies who work in that way generally earn 15% less than the other three ways. So any of the other three ways might be better. But I think for schools, there's some interesting lessons here. The ad hoc way of going about making change happen or having a creative change is what I call the superhero head teacher with their cape flying behind them. So very little visible process, but people love them and they feel very consulted, lots of conversations going on. And you may recognize yourself as one of those leaders, or you may recognize your boss as one of those leaders. Superb fun, but by this point in the year, you are exhausted from working with them because you're constantly in negotiation about what the creative idea is going to be or how you're going to go about things. And there are a lot of ad hoc teachers as well, so the students actually don't understand what goes in to making that amazing lesson or unit of work, but they feel really engaged by what the teacher has done. But it's exhausting for the teacher, it's unsustainable, and those are superhero teachers. Sounds great, but it's not sustainable. The administrative way of doing things in schools is generally marked by lots of surveys. So when people say, oh yes, we consulted the staff, we did a survey, okay, that's all I need to know that they're going to ignore everything that was said in the survey and go with what they wanted to all along. So administrative approaches are very old school, and people don't feel particularly consulted, but there's lots of back covering because there's evidence that they did their job, you know. We did ask, is the line, you know, we did ask, we did consult with you, but people don't feel that they were particularly consulted. So the collaborative approach brings the best of both worlds. Really visible process and a genuine sense of conversations. It takes longer, it costs a bit more time, and therefore it probably costs a bit more money. And if you're a teacher, you might say, well, it's all good and well to say that we need to do things in a more collaborative way, but I just don't feel I have the time to do it. And that's a fair point, and it's one I want to explore and show that it needn't be like that. Before I do, though, I want to, the thing I always do, especially in venues like this, where you're going to be eating lunch shortly, is go and inspect the kitchens. And when I was at the International School of Luxembourg, for 2 years, I made a point every morning of inspecting the kitchen, but only because of Pascal. And Pascal is quite possibly one of the best school chefs I've ever seen in action. And he said this, c'est pas forcément parce que c'est cuit que c'est bon. You get it, right? And what he was saying is, when it comes in, he's in at 7 o'clock in the morning, preparing the rôti de bœuf, like the beef roast he's going to make for the kids that day. Some of his colleagues will only arrive at 10 a.m. to do the same thing. He'll cook his long and slow. They'll cook theirs hot and fast. Just because it's cooked doesn't mean it's good. So taking your time to do it right is a decision you as a teacher can take. Taking time to have a conversation with young people about what you're going to learn, how you're going to learn it, and most importantly, why you're going to learn it is super important. So when I go back to my colleague, Cannon Robinson, and his take on what that collective creativity means, that's begun to inform everything we do in our team, there are 7 things that are worth bearing in mind. The first is that if you want that collective creativity, and you don't want it to take forever, the first thing you need to look at is being open. So being open about everything you do, about your planning, about how you're going to go about doing something, about what you're trying to achieve, about the obvious goals and the unobvious goals. The second thing is that it requires an elimination of hierarchy for a moment in time. You need to be able to hang up your job title to be able to look at things from different perspectives, particularly the perspectives of students, or if you're a head teacher, from the perspective of your team or your parents. It means your communication has to be non-stop. In fact, people talk about over-communication. So not being afraid to have conversations that challenge why you're doing something. And not because it's being annoying to the person opposite you, but because you genuinely want to make sure that everyone understands why you're doing what it is you're trying to achieve. You need feedback loops, which are constant. The background images you can see are engineers that we spent 3 years working with at ThyssenKrupp. At the student workshop tomorrow, I'm going to show one of the crazy inventions that we helped create with these engineers, taking them out of their comfort zone, putting them for 3 days at a time into this kind of heated environment. It meant that they were constantly giving each other feedback on ideas and perceptions of what's right, wrong, true or false in their world of industrial engineering. You need a constantly adapting system. It's no good starting the beginning of the year thinking that the system that you have for achieving your results is the way you're going to be doing it at the end of the year. So being very aware of why you have the successes you do and creating a system around it so that you and your team can reliably have the same successes, but not being afraid to test the assumptions behind that system all the time. For example, there are many schools who are very proud of the fact that they model everything on direct instruction, that they do what I'm doing now. They speak at students a lot. And you know what? There's quite a lot of evidence that direct instruction can help in learning, but not all the time. And so being able to constantly adapt that system means you've also got to be open to pushing the assumptions behind it without fear of being chastised, without fear of being, as I call it, edu-wonked, which is where someone comes back at you with, the research says, ... and puts the onus on you to justify why your testing of the assumptions is valid, rather than taking on the onus of proving that their way is better than the new way being proposed. Constantly adapting systems require all the things we've just talked about: openness, removal of the hierarchy. They also require a little bit of comfort with chaos. Order and chaos together are what lead to creative results. You've never seen a great idea come out of a spreadsheet. This is fact. You may think you've come up with a good idea from a spreadsheet, but I think we've already seen this morning in the first keynote with Professor Alan Duffy that spreadsheets can't do everything, and certainly the human eye can be even better than artificial intelligence at spotting creative patterns. So you need order, sure, but you need a little bit of chaos as well. You need to make room for that. And then the 7th and final point is the ability to work in nonlinear ways. I was just a couple of days ago having breakfast with Jay McTighe. He's the person behind a lot of Understanding by Design, UBD, that I've heard about from a lot of Australian educators before I knew that he'd been an instigator of it. It was a really interesting discussion because I was saying to him how in real life that we work in and real life in schools, it's very rare to find a problem that you know the answer to, that you can work back from. Because if you're going to, imagine knowing the answer to the problem that you're asking kids to solve, and you work back from the solution all the way to where you are now. What you've just done is what I would call Googleable thinking. If you know the answer to the problem and you can design an entire unit of work back from it, you've just created the most dull as ditch water unit I could ever imagine, because everything in it will be Googleable. I'm thinking of the story that you told, Andrea, of the kid who invents a piece of industrial clothing with ideas that no one has thought of, who is now saying, "Miss, do you think we can get a patent on it before we have to submit this to a competition in a week's time?" There's no way that Andrea and her colleagues could have predicted what this kid would have come up with. And in fact, from what you were saying earlier on, it was precisely the kind of child who perhaps in a traditional system would be overlooked in the middle of the class. So understanding with the end in mind isn't possible in most situations. So how do you create that non-linear environment in school? Well, one example of this, that I'll share a couple of examples, but one example I'm going to take is from Minecraft, the world of Minecraft. And this is not a new story. This is an old story. So you're going to notice some things. The first is they used a wiki to plan it. That dates this story by at least a decade, doesn't it? But it's a great story because here is effectively the provocation or the brief from the educators. It's not bad brief. Basically, it's saying, the world is ending because we've got unsustainable practices. This is a decade ago. Fortunately, we've discovered a new planet. Can we move? The question is, can we move there? What's required? That first paragraph was enough because they're teachers. Look at what they went on to say. Go down to maybe the fourth line from the bottom. The policy is as follows. Everything that's built in Aroa 56Z must display evidence of learning related to the key subject areas, science, sustainability, and biospheres. These subject areas will be formally taught to the group in the early stages of our new civilization. There, in one go, you've managed to totally kill the potential of creative collectivity. Why? Because the boss has told you where you're allowed to play. Don't play in that sandpit over there. It's not allowed. So the first thing they tried to do was get rid of that order. And it's really tough to do. In the first few weeks, it was complete chaos. In fact, the children requested help from the adults because it descended into chaos. The child would make this beautiful space shuttle, and then another child with an anonymous username would come in and grief it. Basically, they, like Lego bricks, they would throw it against the wall, metaphorically, and break it up. So the kid would come back and discover the beautiful thing they had made had been destroyed. This is a common thing when you're starting out in Minecraft. The order and chaos had tipped into chaos. There was disorder instead of order, and the kids wanted that order. So they did what any kid does. They ran to the teacher. What did the teacher do? What would you do if a kid did that in class to you? It said, "Miss, sir, so-and-so is annoying me." What do? You tell them, first of all, try and sort it out yourselves. Have a conversation about it. How do you do that in a digital space? Well, the teachers here did what all teachers do. They got the red pen out. Now, it's astonishingly hard back 10 years ago to actually turn ink on a wiki red. You have to code it. You actually have to learn how to code red into the text. So the teacher's gone to that trouble. And she writes this: urgent transmission from the Supreme Council. The Supreme Council is the teacher. The Supreme Council hereby decrees, because that's what teachers do, that each district is to begin construction. It's really funny how the language is, it's seeking hierarchy, seeking order. The language goes into the realm of the empire, Urgent transmission from the Supreme Council. It's come to our attention that the construction of the district is occurring to the detriment of the environment. When I say that through this microphone with that echo, it's not out of place with the Hunger Games. It could have been that little voice. The districts must produce a plan to offset the damage caused to the natural environment. And then, as kids go about it, the teacher here is really defined by their identity. So they think their identity is about closing opportunity in a way, closing it off, adding hierarchy, letting them know who's boss. One student obviously just went over the mark. The Supreme Council does not approve of your tone, Andrew. So what did they set about doing? Well, it was all the usual stuff. And they had some interesting ways of communicating. Communication, that frequent communication, clear communication, is really core to having collective creativity. We occasionally, my colleague Chantel is here from Adelaide. She's half asleep because it's already evening time for her. But we have challenges sometimes where we get radio silence. So you send a piece of work off, 1 day, 2 days, 3 days pass, 7 days pass, and you're phoning, you're emailing every day to say, can we have some feedback on that first draft? Nothing. And that's under communication. Over communication is where you're on WhatsApp. My phone's going off because customers in Europe or schools in Europe are beginning to panic. It's the end of the school day, so they're offloading. They're saying, how would you go about this? How would you solve that? Over communication is so much better because at least you know where people are hurting and where people need some help and support. But radio silence, going rogue, doesn't work particularly well. Here, students were over communicating, so they constructed a big eye that lets you know that you're hitting the industrial zone. So don't build other things. Don't build houses in an industrial zone. So the students began to create that sense of order that they needed. And it was vast. The world was vast. When Cannon went to investigate this world afterwards, it took about 6 months to try and get to all the corners of it and work out what was going in. They built all sorts of things here, a tree farm to encourage oxygen on the planet. They realized that the energy and being sustainable was important, and that was a line they wanted to pursue. So you began to see emergent phenomena, people collaborating to work out what it would take to build a real solar panel, where it would have to be positioned in line with the planet's sun in order to gain that information. They took surveys and tried to teach each other through the wiki. So you'll see examples of where their research is shared with everyone in the class. What it means is that everyone's as smart as the smartest kid in the class because everyone is sharing what they're discovering in one place together. It's slightly chaotic. If you can imagine doing that non-digitally, it would be the wall covered in data. Here it's digital, so it's a little bit easier maybe to navigate. Solar energy was one of the key things, of course. It's quite predictable maybe, but there was the son of a Russian scientist who was in the class, and he decided, we're going nuclear. And he self-taught everything himself. He spoke to outside experts, phoned them up, had Skypes with them to understand what was required. He added his notes to the wiki alongside the solar energy. And in the end, you know, in spite of soapboxing it for a couple of weeks, he didn't manage to get agreement from everyone. They said, no, we're not going to do it. It doesn't feel right. In the end, you know, he wasn't able to build it on the planet. And so all around the planet, instead, you would find wind turbines and solar panels as people generated enough energy to run the planet they were on. Little did they know that this kid had, in any case, found a remote corner of the planet, and he built his nuclear plant, and that was actually the reason that they had enough energy to run their planet. And what you saw were children solving problems. So we don't have enough energy for what we're building, we need to get enough energy. But what they were doing is not just solving problems, they were finding great problems and then shaping the problems. And for a decade now, my team and I have been banging on about problem finding being the number one thing that kids need to learn how to do before they leave school. Because when we work with engineers, what we find are incredibly competent PhDs who are able to solve whatever problem is put in front of them. But their companies lose money because they're not finding new problems to solve. It's great for our business because as non-engineers, we ask all the daft questions that test the assumptions and help them find new problems. But frankly, they could be doing it themselves. And the same's true in schools. At the American School of the Hague's one example. I thought I'd give a European example. This is what it feels like at the moment. I'm so happy to be here because it's not -6 and cold. But when we go to the Hague, we were asked to re-articulate the school's mission, its values, its vision, and its strategy. And we applied those same principles of collective creativity to how a school goes about defining itself and where it's going to go in the future. And very briefly, I wanted to show you how we do it. And the very first step in this kind of work is just to work out, where are you now? What makes you who you are as a school community? What is your secret sauce? What makes me want my child to not only come to your school, but stay there and to be part of your community? What makes me as a parent want not just to pick my kid up at the end of the day, but come in and be part of the projects you're running in school? So what do? We bring together a design team that represents as many people in that community as possible. And in fact, we've done a very similar process in the last couple of weeks all across Western Australia as we try and work out the strengths you've got in learning and technology that we can build on as you look to the next 5 to 10 years ahead. Where are the strengths? How do we do it? We get that design team interviewing every segment in the community. If you can imagine a design team of 30 people, in the space of 6 weeks, will interview at depth and at length nearly 300 people. It's only 10 people each, but that's a massive in-depth inquiry into what's working, what's not working, and what makes this place special. We bring specialist groups together, administrative people who are not teaching every day, but people who help make that possible. We ask teachers to shadow a student for a day, or head teachers. A favourite piece of feedback from a head teacher doing this was how exhausted he was. A high school head teacher, he said, I shadowed a student for a day and I was exhausted. But I was exhausted from sitting down all day long. And as a head teacher, he completely changed the pedagogy of his school. They had been quite proud of their direct instruction approach that got them stellar grades. But after one day shadowing a student and realizing how awful the experience is, he said, it doesn't matter if we get great results, but their experience of learning is like that. We have to make the experience of learning as stellar as the results that we achieve. You only get that sometimes by the visceral experience of doing it for yourself. And organising town halls, parent breakfasts, I find myself very often facilitating parent breakfasts because no one in the school has the nerve to do it themselves. The first half hour is like a therapy class where everyone just lets everything, all the bile comes out. But then the good stuff comes. The insights that parents have in your schools is fascinating. Stuff they would never tell you to your face, but somehow give them a post-it note and a croissant and they're anyone's. And then bring classes into what we call the project nest. So having 20, 30 kids at a time coming into a project nest and filling it. So they'll see what other people's perceptions are at that moment in time, what's working, what's not working so well, what makes us so special. And when they see that, they build on it. You see a Diamond 9, which is a tool to prioritize what's most important. And they might come in and start changing the order of it and leaving a note as to why. And so you end up with an asynchronous conversation over time. This is a wiki. This is a wiki, but it's a wiki from paper. And it's so accessible. You don't need a device. You don't need to know how to code red. You can take a red Sharpie and go for it. So what we end up doing is with this massive data, we have a bit of a problem, which is working out what matters most. Because you saw the quantity of data. This is one segment of the wall. So generally, you end up with 5,000 or 6,000 data points for one school of things that matter most. And much like Alan said this morning, we don't put that in a spreadsheet and press a button. We get the whole design team for a day handling every post-it note. It's like the Marie Kondo of education. You take it off, you hold it to your heart. Does it give you joy? Or something like that. And they're fantastic at it. They're better than any computer. And we give them some different tools. And we're looking at how you do that in some of the seminars throughout these 2 days. But what's interesting is how students, with teachers, with board members, with parents, with administrators, very quickly get a sense of the pulse of a school, and they're able to produce something magical. Now, the American School of The Hague, I'm not able to show you what they came up with, because their board is approving it tonight, if all goes well. And it would be a shame to show you something which they don't approve. So instead, here's one I made earlier. I mentioned the International School of Luxembourg. This is where Pascal is the chef, and their mission, defined with the community, was that everyone who joins our community leaves inspired, resilient, and passionate about achieving anything they want to make a difference anywhere in the world. This was a new purpose defined by the community. That's the point of going to that school. And everything you do in that school is filtered through it. So getting a great grade doesn't figure. It's how you go about getting your great grades that matters. And their core values, which they use, shape every project they undertake in school. So you will find that people in this school genuinely test every assumption you come with, because they believe that change is always almost a force for good. They believe that learning happens in and out of the classroom. So in the heart of Luxembourg, you'll notice that trees are beginning to appear, that they're looking to build a new campus out in the forest because they're so concrete bound. It looks plush, but it's useless for outdoor learning. They believe you can achieve more if you work as a team. So it doesn't matter if your kid is a genius. We don't want any genius jerks. You know, the ones who will actively do someone else down even. I had one student in a similar school, but a different one, who said, he's in grade 12, and he said, quite frankly, by the time you reach grade 12, you realize that you got to step on the fingers of other people if you're going to achieve what you want to. That's a totally different vibe from this school, where it's the opposite, where you need to achieve, if you want to achieve everything, you need to do it as a team. They have another one, we believe in looking after each other like family. We sometimes talk about jumping on each other's grenades. So when, if someone throws you a grenade but you can't catch it because your hands are full, your colleagues jump in and grab it for you. It's a bit of a weird metaphor if you teach in a primary school, but and we believe in the power of listening to each other. So the greatest service you can give others is listen to them. Listen to what they have to say. So their values as a school actually encapsulate those 7 elements of collective creativity. Openness, no hierarchy, the ability to test assumptions, to have that mix of order and chaos, over communication. And you can see the same in other projects that we're undertaking. Chantel's been leading a fantastic project in Panola High School. This map is more for my benefit than yours, but it's right in the middle. I know the area for wine. That's about it. It's Coonawarra region. There's a recognition there from last night. And the students even undertake classes in the industry. I would call it oenology classes. So they go out learning about wine and how to make it. As a school, what's its secret sauce? Well, its secret sauce is that students here work together. They are collectively creative, and some. A couple of years ago, the school and the team just made a decision, and sometimes that's the most important thing. They made a decision that collective creativity would be at the heart of what they do, that they would use design thinking as a way to achieve that, but they wanted every teacher and every young person to understand the ingredients required to work collectively for a broader, greater outcome. And at the very beginning, we set teachers storyboarding the kind of learning they would like to see, actually visualizing the kind of learning they wanted students to see. And they were thinking about how students might respond to provocations that they would give. Would they explore the areas of the curriculum that the teacher hoped they would? Is the teacher going to be providing enough provocation? Is there enough material there to fuel their imaginations? Are the key questions that I'm thinking of actually moving them beyond Googleable thinking into the unGooglable world of thinking? So the teachers working in really quite a simple way at the beginning kept at it. They kept going. So at the start, you might have heard Year 8 students pitching ideas for revolutionising tourism in their town. That's quite a simple brief. Revolutionise tourism in our town. The constraints are there, quite a lot of order, not a lot of room for chaos. But the process that leads students to respond in novel ways, where each team member is taking on the problem in a different way means that there's no such thing as that kind of cookie-cutter presentation where you have to sit through 20 versions of the same explanation of the gold rush. Sorry, that was a traumatic lesson I had to sit through once. It made me never want to sit in another history class in Australia ever again. In a matter of months, the teachers who were completely new at this way of learning pulled together what we would really consider a world-class unit of inquiry. It engaged the cohort, but it actually began to engage the whole community. Why? Because their prototypes went beyond the brief. They went beyond advertisements and went into amusement parks. They pitched, you can see them here pitching to one of our colleagues in Sydney. They pitched their ideas to not only us, but to local people to try and make them happen, to address the bigger issues. And this enthusiasm opened up storytelling about the amazing things going on in this school, which opened up the possibility to get a grant that allowed them to then engage with all the local primary schools for a collaborative project where they taught local primary schools the techniques they had been learning around thinking differently about learning, about getting thinking out there and in the open, not locked up in your head. And they used technology to facilitate asynchronous group discussions between students and teachers, secondary and primary school teachers. And the key question that they were looking at was, how do we move these kids from solving problems that we give them into problem finders? So what they started to do was work together. And students working together were really quick to spot problems and challenges that could be solved in their world. So together, here are the kind of problems they came up with. How might we use gaming to increase active lifestyles? Beautifully provocative ones that take something that most adults think is maybe a bad thing and turning it into a force for good. How might we use gaming to get people into the natural environment? How might we increase energy in students so they'll be active after school? And how might we encourage people to get out of the house and meet new people safely, a way to engage older members of the population? So, very simple projects in some ways, very simple pedagogy in some ways, but put together with an emphasis on collective creativity. Penola and schools all over Australia like them have been able to get their students defining the problems that they then go off to solve. Problem finding, problem shaping, and then problem solving. How? By being open, by removing the hierarchies of the traditional classroom, by placing an emphasis on over-communication, on feedback loops between students as much as between teacher and student, constantly testing and adapting the systems in which we work. The systems that you maybe feel are on top of you are actually waiting to be pushed back and adapted and bent to work for your purpose. By having an equal proportion of chaos with the order that we like to have sometimes to see what flourishes from it, and by making sure that units of work are not linear, working with an end, a contrived end in mind, but are with students' perceptions of what matters at the front of our heads. Now, this is super important, and I'll end with one very quick final story. We use these principles in everything we do because it's not just 30 kids in front of us that we're trying to appeal to. If I take one story, with Lego, Lego have for many years now run an event called Build the Change. This event takes place all over the world and it engages children in play. It sounds simple, but there are more and more children, particularly in urban areas, who have forgotten how to play. When I was little, the average area that I played across, statistically, would be about 3 miles. In reality, I was in the middle of nowhere, and my play space was about 30. We would jump on the bikes and get lost. The average distance from home that children play today is 70 meters. There's a great report called the Knee-High Report that gives you more of that kind of data. So helping young people find out how to play and helping their parents understand how to do it, not seeing Lego as a toy that gets under your feet and annoys you at the end of a long day, and not seeing the television as the babysitter, but realizing that play is how children will learn beyond school was super important. What we wanted to do was expand the tens of thousands of children who are able to benefit from this to something more ambitious. So we developed a bunch of challenge cards about 20 or 30 challenge cards, and they have what we call Goldilocks challenges. They're not briefs that are so tight the answer's kind of in the question, and they're not so open that it's completely chaotic. They're Goldilocks, just right. We thought we had 20 or 30 good challenges, so what do? You go and test it. So these are my two girls, off school on holiday, being dragged to work with me. And we tested out our challenge cards with real live children all over Edinburgh to see their ideas for the future of school. And from the 25 or 30 ideas I thought were fantastic, only 7 survived the take of a 9-year-old. And so what did we do? We took it all around the world. And we made national news. I've just come from Cape Town, and this is us on national news in Cape Town, with maybe the most enthusiastic news presenter I've ever heard.
Holding hats and letting their imagination run wild.
So they were given the same challenges. They were encouraged to build their dream school. And what did they come up with? The answer is really predictable stuff for the first 10, 15 minutes or so. And they still had 15 minutes left. So it's when they got bored that the magic started to happen. And so kids started to create all kinds of interesting environments where they would have zoos in their school, and why not? If you're in South Africa, why not? I want a lion in the playground so that we can observe nature and see how it affects. Now, the impact of children undertaking this prototype, in the last year, we've been able to reach 850,000 children learning through play. We've captured everything that they say about the future of school, partnering with UNICEF to build this together and start compiling data into what young people think the future of education could be. But 850,000 isn't quite enough to get what we would call big data. So over the next 3 years, we're hoping to reach 8 million children and finding out their ideas on the future of school, on the future of the planet, compiling that and sending their ideas to the decision makers, so that it's not just one child or Friday strikes that make the point for children, but children can make their point through play as well. I hope that you go away from this keynote inspired to try some collective creativity yourselves, and that you realize letting go a little bit and introducing a little bit of chaos into your teaching can invite ideas beyond what you or I could imagine today. Thank you so much for coming along and for the welcome to your wonderful city. Thank you.
That was fantastic. I feel inadequate again. We went to the same university, and he does this and I do that. Anyway, that was brilliant. I always watch the audiences, and I always sort of obviously very intrigued to see what sort of captures people's attention. Everyone was captured by everything there, but as soon as you put that mission statement up from Luxembourg, everyone is going, that is such a cool thing. It's so different, it's so important. But thank you.